What is his condition right now?
У него сильная кровопотеря, сейчас лежит в коме, в тяжелом состоянии. Теперь дедушку надо как-то подтягивать, потому что я без него не смогу. Очень злая на Путина. Вот это одно слово, что ему дала плохого Украина, он уничтожил все наше, все уничтожил.
Alexandra's husband passed away a few days later.
It must be very difficult for you as a mayor who, has this big responsibility. It must be personally very difficult for you.
Yeah, sure, but I'm trying not to think about it. It's war here, as you see.
And what if the Russians come? What then happens
We'll
to
fight
you?
with them. We'll fight with them. We will kill them because they are trying to kill us. Our families, our women, our parents, our children.
Это очень тяжело, да, действительно, особенно когда ты видишь тела погибших детей. Я не могу сдерживать слез в этот момент.
Скучать по маме, да?
Все, давайте быстрее.
Все, смотрите.
Да, все, Костя.
Взяли.
Ребята, отойдите. Немножко назад. Можно подъехать в следующую группу.
Героя війна, який захищав, також себе не зміг захистити.
Ну, а для душі спочилого раба Божого прославленого убієного воїна Сергія лише одне царство небесне, вічний спокій.
У мене ще двоє внуків маленьких, я должна їм допомогти.
What is your message to President Putin?
Щоб його діти і жінка пережила іще хуже, що пережила я. Я буду приходити. Ой. Ой, я тебе промазаю. Ой, ти ж мені герой.
That was, an excerpt of a compelling current affairs report by journalist Isabel Yong from New York-based Vice News. This is Wednesday, the 30th of March, 2022, 36 days into the invasion of Ukraine by Russia on the 24th of February. I'm Vishwas Sadashivan from Singapore. We have with us live from Ukraine, Olena Kuriata, a victim of the war. Olena, we are very grateful to you for agreeing to talk to us, even though it's risky. I understand you have had to leave your home in Kiev and are now in Western Ukraine, supporting and assisting the Ukrainian armed forces there. Tell us more about what you have experienced. Take your time in sharing that with us, what your feelings are about everything that's happening. The video clip was very disturbing for us, for me. I'm sure it was that much more disturbing for you. We'd like to hear from you.
Your Excellency, and all the present today, good evening and good afternoon. And basically, these greeting words we are not using anymore here in Ukraine, because since 24th of February, our afternoons and evenings are not good. Those videos we've just seen, it's only a small pictures that can probably address to you, to the whole humanity in the world, how terrifying, how cruel and how terrible these days are for us, for Ukrainian people, and actually for all people in the democratic world. We are all living here in Ukraine, our 24th of February still, the long, terrible day that is called the war. This word I've been listened to many times when I was a little girl from my grandma, which is hopefully passed away 10 years ago, and she is not living anymore within these terrible conditions. And she told us when we were little kids, the most important thing is that war has not come into our homeland, our houses. Since 24th of February, I totally understand what are underneath those 3 letters. This is crisis for all humanity, for children, for people, for mothers, for soldiers, for all humanity. This cannot happen in the 21st of century. Everything is online when you can get the right information. However, it happened. And I'll be honest with you, we got a lot of predictions from US and UK intelligence that this is gonna happen, this will start. And we didn't believe in that. But our morning on 24th of February has started with missile attacks, with bombs and terrible noises that we will never, ever miss that. We will have those noises in our minds, in our thoughts, and I'm not sure that we will be able to come back to our previous lives. On 24th of February, my family decided in the panic attacks to come together and to stay in our country house, which is outside of the Kyiv, like in the Kyiv region. And basically that was not probably the best option, the best decision. However, we didn't feel that the war in our previous life. There were 15 of us, 10 adults and 5 children, 5 dogs and 4 cats. And we were staying together in a small house, cooking for those 15 people, trying to support each other. And we're on the news 24/7. We were under bombing attacks, listening to those terrible noises of missiles and rockets, feeling how the country house is shaking and the windows trembling. And that was awful. Honestly, we did not realize that that is happening in real life, that that is happening to us. We felt like we are living in a nightmare for a long period of time. After 1 week, we decided that it's not safe anymore to stay in Makariv region, in Makariv district. And we decided to relocate somewhere else, somewhere to the central or western Ukraine. And at that specific period, my parents decided to stay. And it's not only my parents. I mean, a lot of parents of my friends, of my colleagues, people of older age, they don't want to leave their houses, their homes, their life, even though it's unsafe. And it was a terrible day when I had to say goodbye to my parents. When you realize possibly this is the last time when you see your parents, possibly this is the last words then that you tell them in person. Sorry for my tears.
Take your time.
We had a long road, even though it was only 450 kilometers distance. But it took us 4 days. Imagine 4 days we were driving to the Western Ukraine because of terrible traffic, because everyone decided to leave the Kiev region and to be in more safe place. Finally, I need to admit that our people, our Ukrainian people, our nation, they are amazing. They are such united, like a single organism, trying to help each other, whatever, like with food, with staying overnight. We stopped for 2 days in one place and then for another night in another place. And we were delivered with food, with beds to stay over the night. And those people are not our friends, they are just someone who decided to provide the help, the support. Finally, we came back. Finally, I'm staying here in the Western Ukraine with my sister. And I do appreciate that I have a sister, because together we can go through this emotionally terrible period. A lot of cautious Ukrainian people started to support and deliver anything that they can do as much as possible to support our country and deliver as much as possible, like cooking and delivering food for older people, delivering feedstuffs for shelters for cats and dogs which were left by their owners in the flats, delivering food and water, knitting and sewing some military stuff. I need to tell you that Ukrainian nation has become united as it was never before. And as a poet said, when you united, you are strong. When you divided, you fall. Now Ukrainians are united, and I do believe that those people will come back as soon as the war ended. And it must end as soon as possible. We need to stop this terrible war. This cannot happen anymore in the 21st century. Our children, we need to stop this war. 143 children have been killed, cruelty killed by the enemy. This is the genocide of Ukrainian nation, and we need to stop this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elena. And that's exactly what Inconvening Questions or IQI is about. We are committed to fostering deeper understanding, empathy, and involvement through informed conversations across boundaries. We believe in meaningful action, and for that, critical awareness is the first step. Today, we are here to discuss the topic, Ukraine, crisis, or is it an opportunity? An opportunity for us to learn, right? And not make the same mistakes again. And I think it's important for us to have a little bit of a background history. Ukraine has strategic advantage because of access to the Black Sea, connecting to Central Asia and Eastern Europe. Apart from the fact that the soil in Ukraine is one of the most fertile in the world, it is home to a vast array of prized resources such as natural gas and metals. Most importantly, Ukraine is a buffer state between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization of NATO states and Russia. In fact, as far back as 1994, then US National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski espoused that Ukraine could be a good counterweight to Russia. His specific words, I quote, "With Ukraine suborned and then subordinated, Russia becomes an empire." In December of the same year, 1994, the Budapest Memorandum was signed by the United States, Russia, and Britain. There was a commitment to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine, and to refrain from threat or use of force against the country. Those assurances played a key role in persuading the Ukrainian government in Kiev to give up what amounted to the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, consisting of some 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads. Now, 2 years later, in '96, President Bill Clinton called for the former states under the Warsaw Pact to join NATO, led by the USA. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined. In 2004, the Baltic states of the former Soviet Union joined NATO. As for Ukraine, 1997 saw a deepening of ties with NATO. From 2010, tension between Russia and Ukraine heightened. The Putin-backed President Yanukovych wanted to move Ukraine away from the European Union or EU, and this prompted a series of protests by the people. And in 2014, we saw one of the costliest land conflicts in Europe, the Russian annexation of the Crimean Peninsula and an area known as the Donbass, right? Both were Ukrainian territory, and these areas have been home to pro-Russia separatist forces and a large ethnic Russian population. In 2019, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine officially split from the Russian Orthodox Church. And this was very critical for Russia. It was a signal. In 2020, the Ukrainian president, the current president, Zelensky, meets with the NATO Secretary General and has NATO named as an enhanced opportunities partner. The reaffirmed commitment and Ukraine's expressed interest in becoming a member of NATO were seen as a serious security threat by Russia. On the 24th of February this year, Putin orders Russian forces to enter Ukraine by force. What was declared initially by President Putin as a military exercise has now lasted 36 days and, according to Reuters, taken 5,000 lives, of which 210 were children. Let us spend perhaps 20 minutes trying to make sense of what really happened here, how it happened, in spite of warnings and calls for restraint from all over the world, including close allies of Russia. To help us have a more critical and meaningful discussion, we have a panel of 4 esteemed individuals who know the subject even though they see it from different vantage points. Her Excellency Katerina Zelenko, Ambassador of Ukraine to Singapore. Thank you for joining us. Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow, Asia Research Institute. He was Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations for 2 terms and President of the UN Security Council from 2001 to 2002. Angela Stent, Emeritus Professor at Georgetown University, former member of the Senior Advisory Panel to the NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. And last but certainly not least, Benjamin William, Secretary General and CEO of the Singapore Red Cross for 10 years, former Ambassador of Singapore to Laos. IQ International is committed to ensuring that the voices of youths from around the world are heard in each discussion. We have 6 youth representatives who will openly share their perspectives, hopes, and probe with incisive questions. Muhammad Fayaz from Singapore, Brian Wong from Hong Kong, Vanshika Kant from India, Sonia Halarovich from Canada, Michael Jitko from the USA, Mohammad Kezer Dial from Pakistan. With that, let's kick off the discussion. Let's start with a 3-minute opening comment by each of the 4 panelists. We have a lot to cover and many voices to hear. So let's keep it to no more than 3 minutes, please. You'll have a lot of time after this to share your perspectives. So why don't we start with Ambassador Zelenko?
Thank you, dear ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, dear co-speakers. Let me start by saying thank you for pulling together such an important and timely panel. At the outset, I would put a spotlight on the proper wording, which is critical now, because this is not a Ukraine crisis, not a Ukraine conflict. This is a full-fledged war launched by the Russian Federation. And this is also the largest European invasion since the World War II. At this very moment, while I'm speaking, residential areas of Ukrainian cities and villages across the country are being ruined by Russian bombs, shells, and missiles. Peaceful civilians are being killed. Some of them are starving to death in the besieged cities like Mariupol. Critical infrastructure is totally damaged. We have reached the 3.8 million mark in terms of movements of people from Ukraine to the neighboring countries. 6.5 million became IDPs, and around 12 million people in Ukraine need humanitarian assistance. Neighboring countries are already stretched to their limits of accommodating millions of Ukrainian refugees. As we see, the planned blitzkrieg has not worked out for Russia. The whole world now admires the size of Ukraine's resilience. Russia has also failed to achieve any of its key military objectives and has suffered catastrophic losses. In retaliation, it has resorted to war crimes and crimes against humanity. A protracted war will inevitably have a spillover effect for the entire world. It will impact food security globally, in particular in the least developed countries, as well as energy security. Sadly, there is no silver bullet to achieve swift peace. The only way is to reach a comprehensive ceasefire. Our ultimate goal is de-escalation and withdrawal of Russian troops to the lines of February 23. Ukraine is committed to a political diplomatic settlement, and we are hopeful that it will happen sooner rather than later. In the meantime, we call on all partners and like-minded nations around the world to double down on military and financial aid to Ukraine and sanctions on Russia. The aggressor state must be completely cut off from the global economy and deprived of the revenues it needs to finance the war. Give us the tools and we will finish the job. The famous radio address by Winston Churchill, 1941. The history repeats. The Kremlin has passed the point of no return, and now, if Ukraine is not provided with the right weapons in sufficient quantities, the world and the rules-based order will never be the same again. So please give us tools and we will finish the job. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Kishore?
Well, first of all, let me commend you, Viswa, for organizing this panel discussion. Because I think if you can make a contribution to solving the problem and alleviating the suffering of the Ukrainians, you would have made a big difference. Now, in 3 minutes, let me make 3 points. The first point is, of course, to emphasize a very clear legal point, which is that this war is illegal by any definition. You mentioned that I was president of the UN Security Council. Actually, I was only president for 2 months, not 2 years, January 2001 and May 2002. But under international law, a war, it can only be legal if it's either an act of self-defense or if it's endorsed by the UN Security Council. So this Russian invasion of Ukraine is neither an act of self-defense endorsed by the UN Security Council. So therefore, by definition, there's somebody else speaking, I think.
Can we all please mute? Can I request that everyone mutes if you're not speaking, please? Thank you. Sorry for that.
So the first point is very clear. The war is illegal under international law. The second point, of course, is that, as you have seen in all the testimonies we've heard so far, in the videos, in the statements by Olena, statements by Katrina, the people who are suffering the most are the Ukrainian people. So anything that the international community can do to help them, that help should be sent as quickly as possible, because the one lesson you learn in war is that actually it's the innocent civilians who suffer the most. I actually lived in a city that was at war in 1973-74 in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, when the city was shelled every day when I was there. And you could see lots of innocent people dying from the shelling, and you go to a marketplace and you see, hundreds of dead bodies. So you understand what war is like. So I think the world should therefore step up its efforts to help the Ukrainians. The third and final point I want to make is that at the same time, we must also treat wars like a form of cancer. Cancer kills people. Wars kill people. To prevent cancer, you must use scientific methods to understand the causes of cancer. And therefore you do this, you carry out the relevant steps to prevent the cancer from coming back, like, for example, to stop smoking. In the same ways, you must also use a very objective scientific method to understand how wars happen. Because once you understand how wars happen, then you can carry out the necessary steps to make sure that they don't happen. And that's precisely why I can tell you I've launched the Asian Peace Program at the National University of Singapore, because the one region of the world that is actually much more vulnerable to wars than Europe is Asia, because the biggest shifts of geopolitical power are taking place in Asia, actually not in Europe. And the dangers of wars in Asia are much higher than the dangers of wars in Europe. And therefore, we in Asia must therefore use the scientific method to understand why wars originate and make sure that wars don't happen. So hopefully we, with the whole world, while we reach out to help the Ukrainians, we should also learn lessons from the suffering of the Ukrainians.
Thank you. Thank you, Kishore. Angela?
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. So I thought I'd just spend my 3 minutes talking about why Putin launched this war. And I think it'll enable us to understand how it might end and going forward. Putin has really never accepted the breakup of the Soviet Union. He's called it the world's 20th century's greatest geopolitical catastrophe because 25 million Russians were left outside of the Russian Federation when the Soviet Union collapsed. He has also on numerous occasions said that Ukrainians are not a separate nation. He does not believe that Ukrainians are different from Russians, and he has always been focusing on how to exert influence over Ukraine and actually how to reabsorb Ukraine into Russia. This isn't something new. These are grievances that he has nurtured for a very long time. And now we see them playing out there. He's also been determined since he became president 22 years ago to restore a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, to relitigate the results of the end of the Cold War, the geographic settlement. And again, Ukraine has always been the main focus for Putin there. The NATO issue, which he talks a lot about, is the excuse for what he's doing. But the longer term goal has always been to reabsorb Ukraine, even if it had remained, and as it is now, a neutral country. There were 3 major miscalculations I think Putin made in launching this war, and we see them playing out now. The first, and you've heard all about it already, is the resistance of the Ukrainian people. He thought this was going to be a blitzkrieg that was going to be over in 3 days, that Kyiv would surrender and Ukrainians would welcome the Russians with open arms. The resistance has been amazing when you look at what the Ukrainians are doing, because they're fighting for something they believe in. And the Russians who are fighting there, particularly the young conscripts, they don't really know why they're there. They're not fighting for a cause. And this is what they're meeting with the very fierce Ukrainian resistance. The second miscalculation he made was about the West and its resilience and its determination to resist this. Putin looked at the West. This is one of the reasons he invaded when he did. And he saw a weak United States. He looked at the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. He saw an administration that couldn't get its legislative agenda through. He looked at a Europe that was distracted by many things, and he thought that the West couldn't respond effectively. Well, he was wrong. And of course, you've had this renewal, if you like, of the transatlantic alliance, also our Asian allies who supported the US and NATO in all of the sanctions. And so the third thing was he did not believe that there would be unity on the kind of tough sanctions that we've seen imposed. So these were all miscalculations. The blame game is already happening in Russia, but so far Putin is digging his heels in. So the question is, how serious are the Russians about negotiating? Obviously, President Zelensky has put a number of things on the table, including Ukraine's future neutrality, not seeking to join NATO, and saying that he's willing to discuss the future of Crimea and the Donbas region with Russia. This will take a long time. And the Ukrainians have been negotiating in good faith. Just yesterday, we had a session, of course, in Istanbul, and the Russians said, we're actually not focusing on Kiev anymore. We're going to focus on the Donbas region. And yet overnight, Kiev is still being bombed. So when you try and understand how possible it is to come to a peaceful solution here, you have to look at what the Russians do, not what they say, because they're saying some of the right things now, and hopefully they will continue to do so. But we still haven't seen even a ceasefire be agreed to, even for 24 or 48 hours. It's been impossible to do that, to provide a humanitarian corridor, because the Russians have bombed civilians when they've been trying to come out. So I hope that it's possible to come to a peaceful solution here. But I fear, as do many of my colleagues, that this could go on for a very long time, and you could have a pause and then it could start again. Because I think as long as Vladimir Putin is in the Kremlin, he is still going to be determined to subordinate Ukraine. And this is what we see playing out.
A quick question, Angela. There's been talk since Saturday that there might even be a plan to forcibly remove Putin.
I mean, I think a lot of these things are rumors. I don't see any proof that this kind of plot is afoot, but you know, we will have to see. As far as I can see, Putin still remains pretty well entrenched where he is, even though I'm sure that there are people who around him who are questioning the wisdom of all of this.
Thank you. I think that's a good segue to you, Ben.
Okay, thanks, Viswa, and thanks for having me on this panel. I'm, of course, the odd one out. Although I'm a student of political science and I was in the foreign ministry for many years, for today, I have to focus my comments as a humanitarian. I want to focus on a few thoughts, a few reflections on the humanitarian disaster that's going on. First of all, I think as Angela mentioned, this is something that might go on for quite a while. Even if the conflict ends tomorrow, the humanitarian crisis will continue for many years to go, including this rebuilding in Ukraine. Since the start of the conflict, as my colleagues have pointed out, close to 10 to 11 million people have been displaced, 7.5 internally, another 4 probably outside the country. But what is it so unique about this crisis from the eyes of the humanitarian? First of all, the speed with which the crisis accelerated and the humanitarian crisis accelerated. As in the words of Alina, we did not believe in it. We did not believe that this would happen. And I think that is true of not only the people of many people in Ukraine, but many humanitarian organizations were not ready for a crisis like this. And as we all now know, it is probably the fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. But I think one thing that is also missed, and sometimes on the ground from our colleagues, we get it, is that this is a complex crisis. So first of all, it is the immediate crisis of the refugees leaving, but don't forget, we are still in the midst of a pandemic. And we understand from the ground that, in fact, one of the things that is needed is one of the things that is in shortage is oxygen. And oxygen, because there are still people being treated for COVID infections and other things. So, but going into my next point is that this is a crisis that has received unprecedented media coverage. Every media outlet reports on this nightly and daily. Yes, there was coverage maybe for the Afghanistan crisis or the Rohingya crisis, but the continuous and comprehensive coverage of the Ukrainian crisis is complete. And I think this has certain implications for the humanitarian response. First of all, I think it gives an opportunity to create greater awareness to the world of the plight of displaced persons, especially, and the victims of conflict. And I think this is something that we as humanitarians will need to continue to work with the media on this, because it is not that the humanitarian organizations have neglected other crises and suddenly we are all on board for the Ukrainian crisis. Some of our budgets for the other crises, like the ongoing Afghanistan humanitarian crisis, the Rohingyas, may be even bigger than Ukrainian budget, the budget for the Ukrainian response. But what humanitarian organizations can do depends on how much support we get. And how much support we get often depends on how much awareness is created by, and especially by the media. So we need to work on this more. Of course, there's so much more that would be needed in the coming days for Ukraine, and day by day the needs increase. But we also need to create greater awareness of the global problem. Secondly, I think what we are seeing on the ground is the emphasis, the importance of preparedness. I think continuing on this point that Olinda made, we did not believe in it. You know, and here I want to just highlight just anecdotally 3 points. 3 areas, very mundane areas. Number one, first aid. First aid has become so important within Ukraine. One of the key activities of the Red Cross members on the ground is to teach people first aid, because they need to take care of themselves, because they don't have easy access to hospitals or clinics as can be expected. But not only the Red Cross, there are actually groups forming of paramedics who are entering Ukraine, moving around, not only bringing supplies or medical supplies, but also teaching people first aid so that they can take care of themselves. So the first anecdote. The second is blood. On the eve of the conflict, the blood authorities in Ukraine actually put out a appeal for blood, and people queued up to give blood. But it emphasizes the point that nations have to be prepared. I give you an example of Singapore. In Singapore, only 1.8% of the population donate blood. In a crisis, whether it's humanitarian, it's a natural disaster or conflict, the people ready to and knowledgeable and aware of the importance of blood donation. And the third is psychological first aid. On the ground in Ukraine now, one of the biggest needs is psychological support. And many of the Red Cross are actually focusing on providing psychological support for the families that have left the country, because many of them have left their men behind. My third point is investment. And this one I want to add to Kishore's point. Kishore basically said we should invest more, paraphrasing him, on why wars happen and to prevent wars. You know, the Red Cross is about 160 years old. In the 160 years, the humanitarian response has only changed very slightly. But the means of war, the means of killing our fellow human beings have increased tremendously. We have invested trillions of dollars almost annually on how to better kill people. But we need to spend more in investment on humanitarian response. And my hope is that Ukraine will be the start of people understanding the meaning of investing on better humanitarian response. How can we do things more efficiently, whether water and sanitation, shelter, food, etc. We need to invest more on humanitarian response, and donors and supporters need to recognize that investment in humanitarian response is as important as the response. Thirdly, fourthly, regional collaboration. I think what is highlighted in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian crisis, is that the number of countries around Ukraine that has to take in the refugees. And let me tell you very frankly, that many of the Red Cross and humanitarian organizations in these countries are actually not equipped. They are already stretched to the limit. I think Ambassador made that point. And actually, people like Singapore Red Cross and other Red Crosses are coming in to support them. I think that it is very important that we focus more and more in the humanitarian world on regional collaboration. And I think regional collaboration will continue to be an important humanitarian response in Ukraine. And finally, my point is that we all need to come together. And here I want to really say that the corporate sector need to really realize that they have a role in humanitarian response as well, because a lot of expertise, whether it's logistics, communication, supply routes, medicine, they all rest in the commercial world. If big commercial companies are even willing to say set aside 1 or 2% of their budget annually for humanitarian response, not donations, I think it'll make a big difference, and Ukraine can be the start of it. Thank you, Visa.
If it's not in the form of money, how do you see these corporates contributing?
Okay, so number one, in logistics, one of the biggest problems that humanitarian organizations are encountering on the ground right now in Ukraine, but even during the COVID response, was how to find logistics providers who would be able to know the trade, know what to do, and how to manipulate the system in order to be able to get the goods on the ground. And I think we can do it in a more determined manner. Big companies that are experienced and have worldwide network. Another example will be social media as a communication. And I think someone made a point about how social media is now so important for the Ukrainian refugees. You know, how better to come up with applications and tools which are targeted at humanitarian response rather than just commercial use.
Right, got it. Thank you. Very quickly, youth panelists, anyone wants to ask a question, make a quick comment? Anyone? Yes, Brian.
Hi, thank you very much for the invitation, Vishwa, and it's an honor and privilege to be amongst everyone who's spoken here and on the panel. I just want to raise a very quick point coming from an angle of political philosophy and ethics, essentially in terms of the roles or the interactions between individuals and states here. It's very tempting to talk of great power politics and characterize Ukraine and what's going on right now, the invasion that is, as purely an event or manifestation of great power politics. But ultimately, they're individual citizens who are suffering the consequences of not just great power politics, but also of the choices of a few select privileged individuals. They're imposing the will not only upon the people in Ukraine, but also amongst many in Russia who do not agree with the war, who do not agree with what's going on in Ukraine right now, and yet are bearing the consequences and the mantle of the repercussions of sanctions and other forms of alienation and isolationary measures adopted against Russia. So I think it's important to separate discussion of the people from the state, and furthermore to recognize that there is agency and that people deserve a recognition of their own voices, their own agency, beyond merely castigation or labeling of them as the tools, as the products, as the subjects and vehicles of great power politics. That's the point I wanted to make there. Thank you.
I see, if I understand you correctly, you're saying Russia does not necessarily, Putin need not equate with Russia, and Russia need not equate with the people of Russia necessarily. And there are different pockets of people who have who don't support Putin. Is that the point you're making? Don't punish those who may not be in support of this just because they belong to that particular label.
Yes, but also that Ukrainian people deserve to have their voices recognized as an independent people, as opposed to merely, you know, incentivized or the products of instigation by external forces. Yes, there might be external forces at work here, but the voices and will of the public in Ukraine, they should be respected and seen as an autonomous entity that's worthy of treatment as such.
Ambassador, would you like to respond to this?
I think you're making a good point, focusing on people, because actually what is going on in Ukraine and around Ukraine is firstly and foremostly about people, their lives, about saving their lives. And we are losing our people on a daily basis. We are losing our children on a daily basis. We are losing critical infrastructure, which actually needs to serve these people. Yeah, we've built up fantastic highways over the last 2 years. Everything is destroyed, nothing to say about the bridges, airports, oil depots, gas pipelines, and so on. Nothing to say about the blocked humanitarian corridors, where these people are not even allowed to pass through them because during this passage they may be killed, and we have heartbreaking stories of whole families being shot dead while passing through the humanitarian corridors. And I think many know about the hard situation with the humanitarian organizations which cannot get access to these besieged cities like Mariupol, where people are cut off from water, power, gas, electricity, communications. My cousin lives in Mariupol. Last time I heard her voice was the 3rd of March. Since the time, I have no idea if she's alive and her partner, if they're alive, where they are, not a clue about it. And this is the situation which we have. But if we speak about people also in Russia, this is also a very important thing to touch upon, because according to the surveys, 70% of Russians support Putin's invasion of Ukraine. They really believe in the fairy tales about Nazis in Ukraine, because over the last, let's say, at least 8 years, they've been spoon-fed the daily doses of propaganda, and they started believing in the fascists in Ukraine and in the need to liberate Russian-speaking cities. Let me touch upon that. The cities like Mariupol and Kharkiv are already well known, worldwide known as the cities which suffer the most. Believe it or not, these are the most Russian-speaking cities in Ukraine. And there are so many ethnic Russians living there whose houses have been destroyed, who have buried their loved ones, their children, their parents, who have lost everything. If you ask them if they are happy with this liberation, you will only hear that they hate Putin and they hate the so-called liberators. So you're absolutely right. It is, at the end of the day, about people. And there are people which could actually make a difference. I really believe that one day, among other miscalculations made by Putin, I will be able to mention yet another point, that he strongly miscalculated the resistance within the Russian society, which one day will be able to be vocal about the need to move the path of peace, of rules-based order, of respect for international law. Otherwise, we will bring the whole world and the whole community of nations under the brink of collapse. This is important to keep it in mind.
Thank you. Thank you, Katrina. Michael, from USA. Michael, you are Russian, of Russian stock. Your parents were born and they lived in Russia and they came over to the USA. How do you feel about this?
Well, there's a reason why we left, right? So after 96, when everything fell apart, you know, it was you're either extremely rich or extremely poor. I think that what we're seeing is, you know, these plays are happening on a level that's way higher than the average person. In 2014, this is when all of this started, when there was a revolution in the Ukraine. The younger people obviously, want to go with the European Union for more economic opportunity. Russia does not want to let Ukraine go because of the strategic military standpoints that they have. I think that it's very sad, the story that Elena said. I empathize with you greatly. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. But being realistic, I think that global politics is based on force and might. If Russia somehow, was able to install military installations in Mexico, could they? Sure. Would they be allowed to? I don't think so. And I think that, the fact that Saudi Arabia has been bombing Yemen, the Uyghurs in China being, essentially tortured and kept enslaved. You don't see a support link or a donate link on Amazon, so I'd be very careful with, any sort of propaganda or any sort of, digital perception that is being fed to us. And remember that these are real people that are being affected. Another point is, our president in 2014, I believe, his son was on the Burisma gas company board of directors, paid a salary of about $80,000 a month, right? Doesn't speak Ukrainian, doesn't speak Russian, doesn't know anything about gas. The prosecutor there started investigating him, Shokin. And in 2018, the Council of Foreign Relations, Joe Biden actually was joking around, saying that he told him that he was leaving in an hour, he wanted Shokin removed, or $1 billion in funding was getting cut immediately. These people are only interested about money. They're only interested about furthering their influence and their power, essentially. Anything that is going on that is, a movement of the people was already, put together by think tanks and, the global bankers of the world. And it's the people that suffer. And, hopefully everyone wakes up one day. That's all I can say.
Okay, Michael. Angela, I see you shaking your head in response. Would you want to say something?
Well, it's not worth getting into. This is a sort of mishmash of a number of different conspiracy theories. I mean, I'm not going to go into the stuff about, about Shokin. This is something from Donald Trump's playbook, but I would just, I would urge caution here, and I would just go back, and agree with the previous speakers that, that it's the people who are suffering, and also say 200,000 Russians have left Russia since it invaded Ukraine. And we're, of course, trying to help all of the Ukrainian refugees, but there's also and these are Russians that oppose the war. And so in the end, we have to help those people too, because they don't want to go back to Russia while this is going on.
Yeah. Vanshika, Keza, let's go to Vanshika first, and then to you, Keza.
Right, thank you. So I had a few points just to add to what's been said. I think, of course, the biggest thing that we see is that Putin and Russia should have learned from the lessons of the US and how things unfolded in Iraq and Afghanistan, to realize that it's obviously much easier to go and invade a place, but the kind of hostilities and the conflict that unfolds continues for much longer, and the kind of resistance that you see goes on much longer. I just want to touch upon a few points here. I think, firstly, in terms of global governance institutions, right? What does the conflict mean in terms of rethinking global governance institutions and their influence and actual ability to step in when there's a world crisis like this? The second, I wanted to bring the aspect of gender and gender and leadership. And I think a lot of people have made this point that if you had a woman in power, maybe you wouldn't have something like this happening. I don't want to make such a general statement, but I think just going forward, it's important to think about how are we building young talent who in the future you have young women who are also leaders in decision-making powers, who are heads of state, heads of companies, so on. The third is a great point was made on the private sector and the role that they can play during conflict. I think it's very important, the current conflict, along with the pandemic and the VUCA environment we're living in, for companies to stop and think about, of course, not just profit, but performance with purpose. And I think we are seeing that happening, where lots of companies now are looking at ESG frameworks, the impact on environment, society, governance, but how can we mainstream that more going forward, and the role that they can play. And I think the other point I want to touch upon is just the importance of crisis management and conflict resolution, and not just training people in it, but like even within public, private sectors, how is that as a theme being developed? And lastly, I think the importance, and as a young person who's here to share their thoughts, I think the importance of global programs, initiatives that bring together young people who are going to be positions of power 20 to 30 years from now, and to train them with a mindset which is collaboration based. Professor Mahbubani mentioned the Asia Peace Institute. I'm part of a program called the Schwarzman Scholars, where the vision is to kind of get people from all parts of the world to engage with China. So I think like more such programs are required, so that hopefully in the future we have people in leadership positions who can deal with things more responsibly and collaboratively.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. We need to move on faster, so let's keep the comments tighter. Kezar and then Fayaz.
First of all, why PM Imran Khan was there and no other significant leader was there with Putin when they decided this thing? Pakistan believed that we have not been treated fairly, and Pakistan has been cornered by US. It is a general perception that we have been cornered, and I don't think that how it will help to achieve different objectives. And one other thing which I would like to just one last thing which I would like to highlight is that in case of Pakistan and India, they are nuclear powers, and it is now in the now we are getting a rising opinion that okay, we should pile up more nukes, because it is what Ukraine could not tackle, and Ukraine is not able to defend because they forgone their nuclear weapons. So we should pile up more. So these are the views. Thank you.
I take especially your last point, that could be a consequence, that people start saying, look, we better take care of our own selves, because we need to start building our own arsenals, right? Yes, because Fayaz.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you so much for having me in this panel. I have three essential points that I think are natural extensions to what have been discussed earlier. First of all, I'm actually, as a young person, I'm very concerned about the misinformation that this war has produced, right? While a physical war is taking place in Ukraine, I think there's also a concurrent war that's taking place in virtual space, and that is the war on information. I think both parties, both Ukraine as well as Russia, are trying to see if they can actually get a hold on the narrative, right? Because again, who controls information also controls the mind. So I think there is an element of misinformation that also sort of distorts people's perspective and understanding of what actually is going on the ground. And more importantly, there's also been attempts to use deep fakes, as we have seen how Russia has tapped on, to ensure that it actually gets a hold on how other people perceive on what's going on the ground. Secondly, I think for me, it's also depressing to see how a conflict like this can have regional and international consequences, and more importantly, how it affects the international economy. As most of us would be very excited about how we are recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, this crisis has also reminded us that the global economy is indeed very fragile and is susceptible to supply shocks, especially when events such as a war takes place. So I think for us, it's actually very distressing to see how risk events can take place concurrently, and also in a very short span of time, things can go down. And I think as earlier a speaker alluded to how it actually affects the global south, I think that's something that countries are looking out for. and looking at how that will affect poverty and, more importantly, food security in the global south. The last point I would like to make is that I feel as a young person, I feel very underwhelmed. Why? Mainly because of how big powers such as India as well as China has responded, right? I think if we have all been looking at how it responded to the vote, right, both of the countries actually abstained. So I'd like to direct a question to Mr. Kishore, given his understanding of global power and, more importantly, his study of China and the US. I would like to see if, I would like to ask if he actually sees an opportunity for big powers such as China and even India to step up and broker peace in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Fayaz. Kishore.
Well, I would say that's a very difficult question. And it's very hard to give, let me be brutally frank, okay? All great powers, without exception, put their national interests first. The idea that any great power is benevolent is an oxymoron. And the one constant lesson of history, which is 2,000 years old, is that there are no exceptions. Great powers will put their interests first. Great powers will sacrifice the interests of other countries if they get in the way of their own interests. So that's a fundamental rule of history, which is an iron law of history, and it's important for us to come from small states to understand that. So to answer your question, China and India are putting their national interests first. In the case of China, China is now engaged in a monumental struggle with the United States. And this geopolitical contest has begun, will carry on for the next decade or two. And China will do whatever it takes to protect itself in this contest against the United States. And China knows that if Russia collapses completely as a great power, then China will be left standing alone to deal with the United States. That will be an enormous loss for China. And by the way, this Ukraine war has already led to 4 or 5 major setbacks for China already, because just as Angela was describing how in many ways Putin didn't understand what he was getting into in Ukraine. He made serious mistakes in Ukraine. I think in the same way, China has also been hit very badly in several different ways by this contest too. So that's why it is logical behavior as a great power to protect its interests by continuing its collaboration with Russia. Now, India's considerations are different because India is not engaged in a geopolitical contest against the United States. India is emerging as a new ally of the United States. And in fact, until Ukraine happened, the relationship between India and the US was getting closer day by day. But at the same time, the Indians are, like China, equally alarmed at the prospect of Russia collapsing because they rely on Russia in many critical areas. First is that 55% of Indian armaments come from Russia. And therefore, they need Russia as an arms supplier. Number two, India has had many episodes in the UN Security Council when it could have faced resolutions that would have in one way or another condemned India for what India did, let's say in Kashmir or whatever it is, right? The one power that has consistently vetoed anti-India resolutions or blocked anti-India resolutions in the UN Security Council has been Russia. And so the Indians remember this. And so to protect their own interests, they will not join in the sanctions on Russia. In fact, as you know, India is actually now doing the opposite. India is actually setting up a rupee ruble account to ensure that it can keep on trading with Russia and bypass the US dollar sanctions that have been put on that. And you know, in India's position on this is very strong. You know, the under a US law, I forget what it's called now, there's a law that will sanction India for accepting the S-400 missiles from Russia. But India will proceed with getting those missiles despite the sanctions that US will put on India. So the short answer to your question is that geopolitics is a cruel business, and great powers will put their own interests ahead of any other considerations, including humanitarian considerations.
So just to make clear, you are merely stating your understanding or your reading of their considerations. You're not, it doesn't suggest whether you agree with those considerations or not. Yes?
I absolutely not. But at the same time, I think it's important for us, if you want to understand the outcomes in international relations, you have to be like a scientist, a clinical scientist. And if something that is happening is terrible, you want to know what's happening, even though it's terrible, then you can anticipate the consequences of it.
Yeah. Yes, over to you, Sonia. Let's keep it short.
Yeah, actually, I just have a question for the experts, because before you mentioned that even with the neutralization commitment from Ukraine towards Russia, Russia will keep like hostilities. So do you think we should focus on incentives or deterrence?
Incentives or deterrence? Okay.
Yes.
I think incentives have been tried. In a situation like this, it looks like you don't have very many options because you need to change behavior fast. Usually, you know, the stick works better under these circumstances, but I'd like to hear from, let's hear from Angela and then perhaps the ambassador. Quick comments, please.
I would agree that it's very hard to see at the moment what incentives would work. I mean, deterrence didn't work in preventing this war, this invasion. And even at the negotiation table, we know what it is that the Russians want the Ukrainians to do. Yeah. Ukraine would like Russia to withdraw its troops, but it's unclear what else the Russians would really give up. So I think we have to focus on deterrence now. I think the incentives would only come once there's a real peace and once the fighting stopped.
Yeah, and it's also got to do with the person, not necessarily the state. Ambassador.
I think the incentives, especially diplomatic ones, are only then strong when they are backed by the strong army. And this is something we are facing now in Ukraine, because of course, every war inevitably ends with the negotiations, and we are already in the negotiation process. Ukraine wants peace, but there are definitely red lines which Ukraine will never cross, namely if it comes to the territorial integrity, sovereignty of the country. But we definitely know that we need to find a peaceful solution, which will bring us ultimately to the sustainable ceasefire, withdrawal of troops, and end of this senseless violence. What we see now and what we hear from the last round of negotiations, we see that the Russian side is ready to move forward on this path of finding a peaceful solution. But let us be frank, there is still a long way to go. It means that now and here in Ukraine, we need support from our partners. We need to be ready to protect our people. And of course, the political pressure on Russia must be put in place. We already have it, and we are grateful to many countries who imposed unprecedentedly tough sanctions on the Russian Federation. But we see that they are not sufficient enough to stop the Russian aggression. It means we need to move forward on this path and see what can be done in the diplomatic domain.
Right, thank you. I have a question, picking up from what you said, Ambassador. As you're aware, as we are all aware, the Times London reported that what appears to be progress. Well, at least until a couple of days back. Russian billionaire and former Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich has been acting as President Putin's unofficial envoy in talks with Ukraine and Turkey last week, I believe. He met with Rustem Umarov, a member of the Ukrainian parliament. It's reported that there's hope for a peace deal, albeit a shaky one, paving the way for face-to-face official talks, which were supposed to be this week, later this week. That's tomorrow, day after. Is this going to take place? Anyone? Is this going to take place? Kishore, Angela, Brian?
What I was going to say is I don't know, frankly. And I mean, one hopes that the negotiations will take place, and it's good that they are taking place.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm glad that the President Erdogan is prepared to take the risk in hosting peace talks, because when you host peace talks,
yeah,
it's very risky. Because the chances of failure are much higher than the chances of success. And of course, whenever they fail, you pay a price for that too. Yeah. So I think in that, the fact that Erdogan is those peace talks is I think a good thing. But what you need at the end of the day, and I completely agree with Katrina, that obviously Ukraine has some red lines where it cannot concede, like its sovereignty, for example. But at the same time, then you got to figure out what are the elements for a compromise solution where at the end of the day, Ukraine's core interests are protected, and you also give an off-ramp for Russia and back down without having to appear to be humiliated. Because clearly, if you put forward a solution, it's a humiliation for Putin, he's not going to take it.
He's not going to take it, yeah.
So that is the difficulty, finding the formula which protects Ukraine's core interests and gives an off-ramp to Putin.
That's right. Brian.
And just to supplement what Professor Mahbubani said, I think what's also needed is an enforcement mechanism to go alongside the off-ramp, where we have both an enforcement against violations of the ceasefire in the off chance that is indeed violated or contravened, and also seeing to the off-ramp is delivered. And I guess beyond domestic pressures within Russia, there are also domestic, the very strong sentiments on the ground in Ukraine there, right? That, to give in or to capitulate, to basically surrender the fight against an external invader would not be something that is morally or normatively or emotively justified, if only for the fact that there's no guarantee of the peace that would come allegedly. So there needs to be guarantee behind the off-ramp, or else it's as good as basically a short-term sort of temporary ceasefire, only to relapse into conflict and violence swiftly afterwards. So that's my supplementary note.
Yeah, I agree. And, we are dealing with a very peculiar person here, right? A tough man leader, the sanctions, the isolation, the literal erasure of Russian voice, even in the cultural and art sphere. Now, beyond a point, my concern is that there's a risk that these measures could backfire, will backfire, and harden Putin's stand. We should never assume rational thinking on the other side all the time, because otherwise we wouldn't have wars. I think this was espoused very much by Xunzi in his Art of Warfare. Right? These sanctions also over time can have a desensitizing effect. This has been talked about. And in this regard, President Biden's remark on Saturday in Warsaw, I don't think it helped. He said, and to quote him, "For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power." Observers are concerned that this betrays US plans for a forced removal of Putin. This is a point that I raised earlier on. Angela, you have actually written a book on Putin, not about Russia, but Putin. How would he be responding? Because we know now that there's a high chance that this crisis is likely to be prolonged. After some time, Putin's position may harden. So how do you think these sanctions, isolation, and the erasure of the Russian voice, all these things will actually influence and shape Putin's actions?
So first of all, let me be explicit. What President Biden said was something that was off the cuff. It came after a long day when he'd been meeting with Ukrainian refugees, and it was obviously a very emotional response from him. Yeah. Clearly, a president shouldn't say something like that, but there is no policy of regime change. And you know, immediately after he said that, the White House tried to walk back what he said.
Yeah.
So Putin has for some time said, I mean, Putin believes that the United States wants regime change. And he said that before. He said that before this war. And he sees the United States as an existential threat, as a, you know, an enemy, and that the US wants to weaken Russia. He said the US wants to cut a juicy piece out of Russia. So he anyway has believed that for some time. Clearly, you know, the sanctions have really and will continue to hit very hard. The dilemma was, you know, how do you respond to something like this? We talked about incentives and then, you know, also pushing back against this. And sanctions were, you know, was the one area where it's a punitive measure, but that you know, with the idea that the Russian state and leadership has to, you know, has to pay for this. So I do think that in some ways, the, you know, combination of the sanctions and some of the rhetoric, Putin is probably feeling more beleaguered now than he was before. I mean, mainly because he's understood the extent of the failure of the Russian army. You know, they've been modernizing the armed forces since the Georgia War in 2008. And I think people, at least outside, are surprised by how poorly they have fared in this war. They have the overwhelming superiority in numbers and in equipment too. So, you know, he has also made these veiled threats about the use of nuclear weapons. There is a concern that he might use chemical weapons, which Russia has used before. And so it is a sort of a delicate balance of trying to push back as much as you can, but disincentivizing him from going that route, from particularly the chemical weapons one. And I think that's why the NATO countries have been explicit. In the US, there are not going to be any NATO troops there. There's going to be no direct conflict with Russia. But I think it is a concern. And I think the best outcome would be, you know, you talk about an off-ramp, or Putin obviously is going to have something that he can claim as a victory if he wants to back down from this. But, you know, Ukrainian neutrality and some recognition of the status of the Donbass and maybe Crimea, again, which President Zelensky has hinted that Ukraine would consider, you know, that could be enough for him to say that this is a win, since in the beginning he said really that his only goals were the Donbass, even though we know in the beginning there were more than that.
Thank you. We are running out of time. I'm going to extend the discussion by 15 minutes. If we can we agree on that? Because there are quite a few hands. And I'd like to talk about the humanitarian tragedy a little bit more. You know, the UN estimates that more than 7 million people have been displaced from their homes because of the war, and that's 16% of Ukraine's population of 43 million. Of these displaced persons, close to 4 million have exited the country as refugees. Over 2 million are in Poland, with Romania receiving over 500,000, and Moldova, Hungary, Slovakia, and Belarus taking the rest. If you do a quick comparison with other refugee crises, Syrian refugees, 6.6 million, but over an 11-year period. This goes back to the point made by Ben, that this is a very quick escalation. Afghanistan, 2.7 million. South Sudan, 2.2 million. Rohingya in Myanmar, 1 million. Somalia, 0.9 million. Now, apart from the numbers, what makes the Ukrainian crisis unique is the refugees are from a developed, affluent country, as we talked about. So issues of internet connectivity and so on. There are two challenges that have surfaced, very unique challenges here. First, human trafficking. There are reports of women and children going missing amidst the chaos. An estimated 200,000 children are living in foster homes and orphanages within Ukraine. And the US veterans in charge of organizing safe passage for these children, these are reports that claim that some 5,000 children are not accounted for. The second point is, the second challenge is mental health. The men, fathers, sons, husbands, brothers, they stay behind in Ukraine to fight. This has led to families being torn apart and a dissolution of the family unit at a mass level. These and the fact of being witness to the carnage and deaths in war have resulted in a significant number of refugees having mental health issues. One estimate from a World Health Organization representative in Poland puts it at 500,000. That means 500,000 people diagnosed with having some form of mental problems, with 30,000 refugees having severe mental health problems. So I'd like to put this as a question for all the four panelists, and I'd like to end by going back to what is this all about? What are we? What do we want? Right. So my question here is this, what is the key lesson we have learned and we can learn from this as humanity, so that we can actually respond better to this?
I hope you'll allow me to respond quickly.
Yeah.
Because I do have another engagement in 9:30. Please excuse me, I have to leave you.
Yeah.
I think the big lesson we have to learn from all this is that we thought that wars were becoming a sunset industry. And indeed, if you look at the longer arc of human history, and this is documented by Steven Pinker, the Harvard professor, the number of people dying in interstate wars has been progressively going down very sharply since World War II. So, which is why this Ukraine war is actually a big shock to the global system, because we didn't expect a war of this scale to suddenly emerge, especially so close to Europe. So the big message this is sending to us clearly, to put it very, very simply, is don't think that wars are, number one, a sunset industry. And number two, I think we should pay attention to the critical point that Ben made earlier, Benjamin William, that look at the amount of money that's being invested in the armaments industry, and unquestioningly. And what is even shocking is that countries are modernizing their nuclear arsenals when we know that if these nuclear arsenals are ever used, all of humanity dies. I mean, what kind of weapons are these? If the United States and Russia, for example, in theory, launch all their nuclear weapons, all 7.8 billion of us die. So what is the point of having weapons that are going to kill all of humanity? But we are stupid enough not to be able to reverse the tide on that. So I think the big lesson from Ukraine, and I'm sorry that the Ukrainian people have to suffer so much as a result of this war, is that I hope the rest of humanity learns a big lesson and says from now on, our first priority is to look out for where the next war is going to come from and then stop it before it happens. And I wish Ukraine all the best, and I hope there will be some kind of peaceful solution as soon as possible, because I think the sooner we stop the suffering of the Ukrainian people, the better they'll be. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Kishore. Angela, you got to leave as well. So tell us what your takeaway is.
Well, I mean, I would agree with everything that Kishore has said. I think on a smaller level, we understand that the European security system that we thought had been agreed upon after the end of the Cold War and the Soviet collapse is no longer working. And we have to go back to the drawing board once this conflict is over and rethink, a more productive way, a more viable way of organizing, European security or Euro-Atlantic security. I think that's a lesson from that. And unfortunately, I think the second lesson is we, at least in the West, should have done more to react and to push back against things that Putin did. After the Russia-Georgia war, Russia just recognized those two entities after Crimea. We should have done more, because I think he rightly thought that he could get away with this since he had gotten away with it before. So I think the broader lesson here is
even Donbass, right? Donbass.
Yeah, in the Donbass.
Yeah.
More seriously, and also not, and for the, for the Londons and Paris and New York of the world, don't be lured by all that Russian money, which people have also profited from, which has enabled the system to develop the way it has. So I think those are lessons for the future. And again, thank you very much for inviting me to this.
Thank you, Angela. Ben, you're muted.
I got a few points. I think number one, to follow up from what Kishore said, I think unfortunately for us, war is not a sunset industry, and I don't think wars are going away. If anything, we learned that we never learn, and we will have another humanitarian crisis like this. And I think important lesson that we learn is that no society can afford to be complacent. I think no one expected it in a first world country. No one expected this crisis in the middle of Europe. So I think it is an important takeaway, a lesson that we can all learn. Therefore, it then means that we really need to be prepared. And I think we need to put much more investment into societies being prepared, whether it's first aid, blood, psychological first aid. You are absolutely right. We are all now scrambling to find people to support the refugees with mental well-being. And therefore, we need to accept the fact that even in humanitarian endeavor, we need to put in more investment. We put in trillions for weapons of destruction. We need to put in at least billions in investment on how to be prepared for humanitarian response, how to prepare our societies. And I would like to reiterate the final point, which is that I think what we have learned in Ukraine, and I hope Ukraine will be the platform where people will come together, organizations, corporates will come together, and then this will become the norm for the future. We will have crises, whether it's conflict or humanitarian natural disasters, but if we all come together, I think it will be much more manageable.
But what's stopping us from doing that?
I think
why did Ukraine have to happen before we start thinking about this?
I think unfortunately, I think there's a certain sense of complacency, and many of these places where the resources rest are in societies that are fairly safe. So we become very comfortable in our affluent surroundings. So I think in a sense, it happened in Afghanistan, or, that's far away, but suddenly it happens in Ukraine, a society that is fairly affluent, first world country in the middle of Europe. I think it's a shock that maybe might wake people up. And let's hope it wakes people up to say, hey, we cannot just leave this to the humanitarians.
Right. Thank you. Sonia, a quick one, please, because we are wrapping up.
Yeah, sorry. My contribution was also based kind of on the same idea, the same way that NATO members are pushing towards a more a higher military expenditure. They also should commit to create this fund for bigger support, because I will say the Ukraine crisis, we as citizens, we always see these wars so far, or that they happen in very unstable countries. And I think what happened in Ukraine gave us a real a very harsh example that it can happen anytime, anywhere. So people should also build capacity, support all these organizations to build humanitarian capacity, humanitarian aid capacity.
Okay.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador.
Let me put it short. I completely agree with the position of the government of Singapore that in the world where the might is right, no nation, no business, no individual can feel safe. And what we are facing now in Ukraine This is not only a test of our ability to join efforts and to stop senseless wars and to stop violence. It's also a test of our common humanity. Every religion teaches us humanity, love, and care. And I think we need to start thinking about many things which some of us have taken for granted, like peace, like freedom, like safety and security of our homes, our families, our loved ones. And if we do, and if we join our efforts, and if we look out for one another and take care of one another, maybe we will give a chance for every one of us to get a new and hopeful beginning for the world, for the humanity, and for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Alina.
Thank you for the opportunity to raise this important time for all the Ukrainians. I wish and I pray this war will stop as soon as it's possible. And, you know, probably Ukraine should have come through these terrible and terrific times in order to be united and in order to be proud to call Ukrainians, to love its homeland, start speaking national language, start wearing Ukrainian national clothes, and to be proud to be Ukrainian. I hope and I believe, as well as 40 billions of Ukrainians believe and trust in the peace at our territory.
Thank you very much, Elena. We are with you. We have come to the end of the program. Please join me in thanking my panelists, Ambassador Katerina Zelenko, Kishore Mahbubani, Professor Angela Stent, and of course, Benjamin William. Our very special thanks, of course, to Olena Koryata for speaking to us from Ukraine. We wish you and your comrades and loved ones safety. God bless. My thanks also to our youth representatives who've raised some very important points, and the last point raised by Sonia is very important. I mean, NATO need not just be focused on military. They can also look at peace, which is actually the flip side of war and military. Mohammad Fayaz, thank you. Ryan, Vanshika, Sonia, Michael, and Keza. Here are my parting thoughts. I'm angry with President Putin. Might is not right. And the attitude that you can do it and get away with it is awful. And the feeling that you can actually get away with it for 36 days makes my stomach churn. At the same time, I'm disturbed that some of us are trying to justify the war. I'm hearing different narratives coming up. I mean, we can talk about maybe mitigating factors, but we can't, the moment we try and start justifying Putin for what he did, what he has done, something's wrong. He may have mitigating circumstances, but that doesn't mean that he's justified in invading another sovereign territory. I'm just as annoyed by the moral self-righteousness of some on the other side who intentionally or unwittingly goaded the one with a gun to fire it. And I'm deeply upset that small states are increasingly being forced to choose a side when given the ultimatum, you are with me or against me. More importantly, it makes me think, what kind of people are we who are gifting to our children, whom we profess to love, a world we have systematically disfigured? Surely there are enough shared interests that are more important, urgent, and existential that we can channel our attention and our energies toward. Instead, we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. Hope. Is it really a lost cause? We must believe otherwise. I can't erase the voice of the mother in the video which we showed at the start, where she was mourning the untimely death of a son. We are responsible. We all are. This was Inconvenient Questions.